Network's family of shows. Available every...
Hello everyone and welcome back again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the show. We are in the home stretch and we have yet another fantasy player profile in the IDP league for you guys at the cornerback position this time. A guy who, like I said before the break, has been constantly hit by the injury bug, especially last year where he had flashes of brilliance when he came back because he was not fully fit, didn't really get the chance to shine in a new defense for him. And that, of course, is Jalen Ramsey, a guy who I know can produce at the best level. He has insane coverage skills. When he's on his game, he's one of the hardest cornerbacks to beat in the league. But he just needs a long run of health for himself. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into what makes Jalen Ramsey so controversial and pivotal in terms of how you view IDP corners. Throughout his career, he's accumulated 663.7 fantasy points. His best season was in 2022 with 129.7 fantasy points at the corner position, still with the LA Rams, I believe. Last year, he had 5 passes defended, did not play as much, obviously, only played about 5 or so games at the latter half of the season. But overall, in this secondary for the Miami Dolphins that's constantly improving, that I really like, in a 3-4 defense that's really going to focus a lot on the back end of things, the freedom that the back end players have, is really going to show me what Jalen Ramsey's made of. And it feels funny considering his years with the Rams, where he's one of, if not the best corners in the league, highly feared by all. But I think that the Miami Dolphins defense is going to become much more open. What I mean by this is that when I look at the pieces they have, they definitely are very strong in their linebacker core. But when I look at their front 3 to 4, they lose a guy like Christian Wilkins, who opens a lot of stuff up for that line. And they add an aging Calais Campbell. I'm starting to think that maybe this squad doesn't necessarily have what it takes in terms of the line depth to really threaten teams. I don't see someone in that front 4 because I really do like the linebackers, but they were also hurt. Let's not forget about that last year. So, when all is said and done, I'm thinking, how is this Miami secondary going to come into play? Because that's where a lot of the depth that they've been adding can prove themselves. And Jalen Ramsey's going to be the leader of that corner group. In a 3-4 defense, when the corners have a lot of freedom, I think the best way to suit them is man-to-man coverage, because that's Jalen Ramsey's forte. If you play zone, he's still solid, but I think that the most beneficial way to get the most out of these secondary players, I really do like Jordan Poyer and Javon Holland. They're becoming very solid, whether they're playing the safety position or the corner position. I know Kader Kohu is still integrating himself in the squad. Had a couple slip-ups. Mainly it's going to be the guy in man-to-man that opposing quarterbacks look at on that secondary to throw the ball against. But when all said and done, I think that this secondary really is going to be one of the more physical aspects of this team. Because in the early stretches of the season, you're not only going to be working back in Jalen Phillips, who had a breakout season before his Achilles tear, but might not be at full fitness. You have to work back Bradley Chubb as well. And those are your best front seven players. So, a lot of the time, more often than not, the ball is going to be thrown against the Miami Dolphins, not run. And when you need that physicality from your corners who can press their man, who can jam their man at the line, that's where a guy like Jalen Ramsey comes into play. When, I think about players who are effective in terms of their culture and what they bring, Jalen Ramsey fits the bill for the Dolphins. I think that, when I think of solid corners, they have to be good in every area and aspect that they're asked of, whether in zone or man. They also have to have that edge to them that their secondary mates will understand and follow. And they also have to have had experience in many different schemes to understand that. And Jalen Ramsey has that. As a Ram, he was asked to be a lot more physical and asked to wear a lot more hats in that defense because, they were much more dominant and much more respected of him. Not saying that the Dolphins are not going to be dominant because they still have the pieces there to maintain their modicum of success that they had last year. But I think that injuries really hindered what they were building. And when you look at the core strength of this team, every single unit outside the defensive line, which is now weakened due to the loss of Christian Wilkins, was hit by injuries. And so, how is that going to affect how the Dolphins play coming out of the gate? Because they really want to build on what they had in the defense last year. When they were on the field, there was magic. But there was only about 2 to 3 games where all of Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, and Jalen Ramsey were on the field. That has to change because they have the scheme. They have the attitude. They're now starting to build an offensive identity surrounding what they know best. But if injuries are going to be what holds them back, then that's really scary to think about because one small thing can really lead to the detriment of the whole here. And Jalen Ramsey is a huge part of that because if you take away one of Bradley Chubb or Jalen Phillips, you might be okay. Because linebacker depth is a little bit more easy to cover up, in my humble opinion, than secondary depth. If you take away Jalen Ramsey, yes, you have Javon Holland and Jordan Poyer, but they haven't had the edge and experience that Jalen Ramsey had coming into the league where he was dominant. And you need that vocal leader as well in the secondary when you're, a younger defense trying to figure things out. And Jalen Ramsey might not be that now because of the fact he has been beset by injuries. He hasn't had time to gel into a newer system. But when all is said and done, Jalen Ramsey, for just his presence alone, brings a lot of mentality to this young team. I really like that they're beginning to become predicated on their secondary play. I don't necessarily think it's sustainable, but when you have that depth at the secondary spots, you have more freedom. And with a guy like Jalen Ramsey, if he remains healthy, gives you even more time and ability for these players to gel together. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's all you can ask from a leader, no matter whether he's hurt or not. Now, my one true caveat is if teams throw the ball more on the Dolphins. That's my only caveat. Because there definitely is going to be a lot of pressure on the secondary early on. Because when I look at the Dolphins front three, like I said, they don't have much potency. I think Calais Campbell's at the latter half of his career. He's just playing it out, seeing what he can do. So there's not going to be a lot of pressure up front outside of Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips. So teams are going to take advantage of that. And Jalen Ramsey is going to have to be ready. And if he's not fully fit, then the secondary has less chance of thriving than if he's not fully fit. Then the walls will come crashing down. Because right now, the Miami Dolphins are an experiment. A lot could go right and a lot could go wrong. And Jalen Ramsey's the center of that. Because lose one of Bradley Chubb or Jalen Phillips, But if you lose Jalen Ramsey in your secondary, that's huge. Because he's the connective tissue that holds that group together. And ultimately, the fantasy player who is going to have a lot of stock if you're looking at the Dolphins. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up to close out the show, we have another defensive line player profile with a guy who just got a big money contract and should be feeling good about going into this offseason. You don't want to miss it. To close out the show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.